In the late 1960s, Japan's primary jet trainer was the Fuji T-2. Now, the T-2 was a fine aircraft, but it was subsonic, and military leaders recognized the need for a supersonic jet trainer to help pilots transition into the more advanced F-104 starfighters and F-4 Phantoms that they would be flying out in operational units. They strongly considered the Sepacat Jaguar, getting as far as contract negotiations, but the talks broke down because of financial considerations, and Japan decided to go their own way. The Mitsubishi T-2 won the resulting design competition and came out looking quite a bit like the Jaguar, which isn't really surprising considering that they were designed in the same era to fill the same role, an advanced jet trainer with a secondary strike capability. The first prototype flew in 1971 and validated the basic design of the aircraft, with a later prototype becoming the first Japanese jet to break Mach 1 in level flight. A total of 90 T-2s were built, and while the Jaguar would go on primarily as a strike fighter, the T-2 remained primarily a trainer. The initial versions of the jet were unarmed, but in 1981, the production line shifted to the T-2K, which had pylons for various weapons and an internal gun. The jet was also flown by the Blue Impulse aerobatic team and served into the early 2000s. What we get in War Thunder is the Mitsubishi T-2, a jet fighter in rank 6 of the Japanese air tree at battle rating 9.7. This was actually one of the first jets I ever did a video with, but we're taking a fresh look in my modern review format. The jet doesn't get a ballistics computer or any defensive systems, but it does have the JAWG-11 radar. This radar set has a regular lookup search mode and a head-on velocity pulse Doppler mode, which is a fairly advanced feature for this low of a BR. It also supports both ACM and BVR targeting. For loadouts, the T-2 can take unguided bombs, rocket pods, and a pair of tip winders out on the wings. As of making this review, no drop tank though. Now, all of your missiles are sidewinders. You start off with the simple AIM-9B, which is a caged seeker rear aspect infrared missile with 10 Gs of pull and very entry-level performance. You upgrade to the AIM-9E. This is basically a 9B, except that it has an uncaged seeker. The performance is still not very good, and really it's just a stepping stone to the AIM-9P. The 9P is a far superior weapon, with 20 Gs of pull and an uncaged seeker with a significantly wider gimbal angle. At this BR, the AIM-9P is a fairly good weapon. The flight performance on the T-2 can take some getting used to, but not necessarily in a bad way. The rate of climb is slightly above average for a jet at this BR, but the overall engine power and acceleration are pretty much similar to other supersonic jets in this bracket, while being significantly better than the subsonic ones. The energy retention in turns is quite good at higher speeds, but once you get below around 800 kilometers an hour, it tends to drop off significantly, and is more in line with similar jets at this rank. Something else to keep in mind is that the jet is a little heavy, and it loses a bit more speed in vertical maneuvers relative to degrees of angle of attack, so it tends to have slow and high loops if, again, you let the speed drop before entering into the maneuver. If you can keep this jet fast, most of these problems completely go away, so just try not to be super aggressive on the stick. Overall, the T-2's combat agility is slightly above average for a jet at this bracket, again if you keep the speed up. And while it doesn't quite have the sustained AOA of some dedicated dogfighters, it makes up for this a bit with its speed and energy retention. If you get energy trapped or sucked into a slow crawl rate fight at like 300 kilometers an hour, the jet's gonna get really sluggish, so don't hesitate to try and disengage and separate away if the opportunity presents itself. Another noteworthy tidbit is that the jet's performance is excellent at high altitudes. Until you get up to like 7,000 meters, the jet is going to retain most of its maneuverability, and it still has good engine performance, so don't hesitate to fly up for vulture tactics. Taking this jet out in air battles is a lot different than it used to be. Back in the day, this thing was absolute king of the meta, but in 2025, it's a bit more average overall. You've got the performance to do high-altitude combat, as I mentioned, but be on the lookout for the small number of jets with semi-active radar missiles in this bracket. If you climb up and you get one fired at you, evasion might be pretty difficult depending on range. Conventional dogfighting at low to medium altitudes ends up being pretty effective with the T-2, and the AIM-9P really overperforms at this BR. It's got 20 Gs of pull, and many of the opponents you go up against won't even have any kind of countermeasures, so if you're careful with your shots, it can be really difficult for opponents to avoid. Also notable is that the T-2 gets a version of the M61 Vulcan cannon with 750 rounds of ammo. This gun performs quite well for the lower end of rank 6, and thanks to its high cyclic rate, just a quick burst will usually be enough to rip the target in half. For ground attack, you can use its bombs to attack bases in air battles, and while it can't take out a base in one pass, it still ends up being an effective way to finish spading the jet. But once you do, I generally suggest switching to air combat with the T-2, as its flight performance really goes down the drain if you're carrying a huge load of bombs. Similarly, this jet isn't really well suited for close air support, since it doesn't have a ballistics computer or countermeasures, but if you must do so, the rocket pods are going to be your best option. Visually, the T-2 is still a great looking jet. You get a whole bunch of great skins for it, including the Blue Impulse airshow paint job, but there's one minor detail that annoys the hell out of me. The afterburner rendering is really outdated, and it just looks awful. In fact, on maps with lower lighting levels, you can even see some transparent texture errors down below the engine exhaust if you look at it from the side. Come on, Snail, that's rookie stuff. Update those flames already. Landing the T-2 isn't very difficult, but it has a tendency to bounce the gear if you come in too fast. You can safely drop gear and flaps at around 450 kilometers an hour, and it gets a drag chute, which is good since the brakes kinda suck. Still, the overall landing performance is very friendly. Inside the cockpit, you've got pretty average visibility, but the low canopy bracing obstructs the forward view in a really inconvenient spot for air combat. The radar scope is lower than I like, but the instruments are good spots, and overall it's not a hard jet to fly in VR, with that one minor issue of the canopy bracing. To close out on the Mitsubishi T-2. This jet has pulse Doppler radar at a very low BR. Its AIM-9P is a very strong missile for this BR. It's a pretty good dogfighter. It's got a Vulcan cannon, and it performs well at high altitudes. However, it doesn't get any defensive systems, it doesn't get a ballistics computer, and its performance drops off hard at low speeds. The final verdict on the T-2 is that this jet may no longer be king of the meta in 2025, but it's still really fun to fly, very effective in air combat, and can be a fairly solid points grinder for this range of the Japanese tech tree. As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, check out this other one.